So excited to be bringing on to the show two doctors. Ahmed Twaij is an award-winning filmmaker and journalist and doctor based in London. He has spent significant time in the Middle East and has volunteered as a medic in conflict zones with humanitarian organizations, including in Iraq. And Mohamed Nour works as an intensive care consultant in South London. He went on a medical mission to Gaza in January 2025, and he was based in Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. He recently tried once again to get to Gaza, but was turned away by the Israeli government. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mohamed, we'll start with you. Tell us what you observed in Palestine, in Gaza, when you were there, and what you've been hearing from your colleagues and contacts on the ground about what is happening right now as we speak.
Sure. It's really interesting, actually, because I went in January 2025, which was probably relatively the best time through the course of the war, in terms of it was about 2 weeks before the ceasefire that I went, and I was there for 2 weeks after. And in terms of, the food situation, it was much, much better than it is now. People were able to buy food. I remember when I got there, there was chicken shawarma there being sold, and everyone was really, really happy. So, and even in terms of the medical things that we were seeing, I mean, the craziest thing was when I was there, that the busiest day that I had was the ceasefire day. I remember everybody was really happy, actually. They really made a big deal about it. I remember everyone kind of got together outside Nasser Hospital in the A&E department outside. There was singing, dancing. We took so many pictures. People would say things like, today is the 8th of October, because the last however many months have just been a bad dream. That's how awful it was. They just wanted to forget about it. And then within about 2 hours, we had the most casualties that I saw the whole time I was there. I was there for a month. And we had, 100 come in. I won't forget the day, because I remember the first, 10 that came in were dead immediately. And it just very quickly became a scene out of a horror movie. There wasn't enough beds. We were treating people on the floor. It was just really horrible. Since I've left, that scene or that picture has only increased. So that probably happens now about 2 to 4 times per day, where you'll have that number of people come in a mass casualty kind of event. The food, people are really, really struggling. Like colleagues that I speak to now on kind of, WhatsApp, whatever, I can physically see that they're much, much thinner. They're telling me, people who don't ever complain, they're saying to me, look, we're hungry. I remember one of my colleagues sent me a picture of, a really small bowl of chips and a small bowl of salad. And he said to me, this is what 4 or 5 of us are going to eat tonight. That's all we have. It's really tough. You almost don't know what to say sometimes. It's really difficult, to the point where even sometimes you message and, things that, even just the concepts there are very different. You'd ask them, how are you doing? And they'll say things like genuinely, I'm still alive. The concept of tomorrow is not even a thing for them. It's like, let's see if we get through today, and then we can talk about tomorrow, what our plans are going to be. There was lots of stuff like that. There was a nurse in ICU who used to bring 2 of her kids with her to work. I'm thinking, what's going on here, right? And actually it was because her husband and 2 other children were at home. And the thinking was, well, if a bomb drops, at least 2 of my kids will still be alive with me. By November 2023, families would come and live in the same apartment building, to the point where they would sleep in the same room. And I'd be like, why would you guys do that? And they said, because at least if a bomb drops, we'll all die together. There won't be some family members alive, some not. It's just a completely different way of thinking that they kind of have to survive out there. So yeah, it was, and it's just getting worse. It's just getting worse. And I read a piece or statement today from the director of the World Health Organization, who basically said, what do you call it other than mass starvation? And the saddest thing is the food is right outside, right? The food is there. It just needs to come in, and it's wholly preventable. I don't even know what to say about that in particular, to be honest.
And can you just explain, why were there so many casualties that day, the day of the ceasefire? Was that a coincidence? Or was it because people felt like they could finally get to a hospital?
Oh yeah, no. I mean that particular day of the ceasefire, people felt that okay, it's okay. We can try and go back to our homes, and so they'd started kind of moving towards Rafah. People, especially the people who went to Rafah, they'd gone there, and essentially they were being shot and bombs were being dropped on them.
This has been kind of signature of how Israel has been acting throughout the war. And at the start they said we're going to create these humanitarian crossings and all these humanitarian lanes and for people to leave the war zones. And what would happen is that they would target those actual humanitarian pathways that they'd allegedly created. And it just it's kind of becomes signature of how they act. Try to make people feel safe, and then as soon as they collected in that area, attack it. And we've seen that with the aid deliveries as well, where people are going to these aid delivery stations trying to collect food and water, and that's what's being attacked. And it's part of this. It's almost, I don't know if you remember the concept of the Hisbah Doctrine, which they were implementing out in Lebanon, where the idea was, degrade a society so much that they kind of turn on themselves. And they've tried to do that through decades in Gaza, but unfortunately, or fortunately for the Gazans, they've been strong enough to stay together that this time they've decided that Hisbah Doctrine is too, I guess, basic. They need to go extra and exterminate.
Right. The Hisbah Doctrine, which, as you said, comes from, I believe it's Dahia is a neighborhood in Beirut.
Yeah.
And it is inherently a war crime, because it includes disproportionate response. It violates the rule of proportionality and the rule of distinction.
It was described by the then IDF Chief of Staff, Gadi Eisenkot, who the idea was, because Dahia is the what was known as the Hezbollah stronghold in south of Beirut, and they wanted to make the situation so unlivable for those people that they would turn on Hezbollah. They've tried to implement the same thing in Iran as well. That's why even Netanyahu, after the bombings that they started in Iran, he told the people to turn on the Iranian government and start a revolution. That was his hope of those attacks. So it's kind of their signature. They've done the same thing now in Gaza, and as Mohammed has described, make them feel good, collect them here, destroy the infrastructure. I think 94%, according to the WHO, of all hospitals have either been damaged or destroyed. 94%. Like, that's not one or two. You can say one hospital may have housed Hamas militants. You can't say 94%. And then even then, there are reasons why we have humanitarian law, and the Geneva Convention state that medical facilities should be sacrosanct. The idea is that they are protected places. Even if a Hamas militant is being treated in one of the hospitals, it still shouldn't be attacked. And that is what the UN says. It's what the Geneva Conventions say. But Israel has continually bombed these places, saying that back in 2008, they claimed that they were firing rockets from the hospitals. No evidence was shown. And they flipped the script now because they couldn't show evidence of rockets being fired from hospitals. They're saying that there are tunnels under the hospitals which are housing either weapons or, Hamas headquarters, et cetera, but we're still waiting for the evidence. And who is it that's suffering? Is the local population. And we're not allowed to almost question about what it is that Israel does. When they do attack a place, that's a civilian infrastructure, who goes to investigate it? It's never allowed to be part of a global investigation. It becomes investigated by Israelis only. Their own military investigates themselves, which is a ludicrous thing. If you have a thief, in London, you're not going to expect him to investigate himself whether he's a thief or not. Yet somehow in Israel, they're allowed to investigate themselves.
Right. They have these zones actually. There's like a red zone, and the whole of Gaza is kind of mapped out, and that red zone's been increasing over the last few months to the point where even Nasser Hospital, for example, is in that red zone, or certainly very close to it. And I asked some of my colleagues who are there, are you still going to be going to work? Some of the doctors, and they will say things like, look, dying isn't a big deal for us. We don't mind going to work and dying. But what they do say to me is, we really don't want to get arrested. The risk of us going and then being arrested, we don't really want to go. And they found that many healthcare workers, especially, it's almost reminiscent of when Nasser Hospital was emptied and closed the first time. This was like February, March of 24. Many of them were arrested. And actually they said, we would say things like, I'm a nurse or I'm a doctor, expecting that, they would, have some kind of mercy. But actually they said, no, it was like we regretted saying anything about that. It was almost like because we said that, we were targeted even more. It's pretty horrific actually that when it was emptied in February, March 24, they would say that drones would come down, almost like quadcopters, and they'd be kind of through their speakers, everybody needs to leave the hospital, and eventually they would leave, right? Because it got to a point where they weren't even able to kind of, Nasser Hospital is like a complex, there's many buildings inside. They wouldn't even be able to go from one building to the other. When you go there, it's really interesting because you see the buildings around the hospital still standing. And they used to say to me, it was full of snipers. When you go and you see the hospital, you'll see bullet holes everywhere, all over. And they would show me pictures on their phones, videos on their phones of people who were, 10 meters from the emergency department entrance who'd been shot. And somebody goes and helps them, they'd get shot. And they would leave them. And they showed me videos of like dogs and cats eating from their dead bodies because nobody would dare go and grab them. And then eventually they would have to leave, and they'd have to go through these checkpoints, and they'd go kind of 5 at a time. And I remember they all relatively said the same thing in terms of what happened to them, whether it was a nurse or a doctor. They would get picked out of the line. They would be made to go to wait in another holding area. They would say to me, one of them, I remember he said to me, I got taken behind a building, and he goes, I remember seeing 200 men all completely naked with their hands kind of with plastic cuffs on, and blindfolded. He said they took all of my belongings, made me like naked, no boxes, nothing. And the same thing. He goes, I remember sitting there for a couple of hours. Then they took us into a building and we were just beaten with, punched, kicked, sticks for another couple of hours. And then they get transported to a prison in Israel, not in Gaza. I remember he said we got packed into the truck. And his words were, it was like we were chickens. It wasn't like we were picked up and sat down. We just shoved in the back of a truck. And then when they get to the prison, they get given, their prison clothes. The plastic cuffs get changed to metal cuffs, and the blindfold stays on. And they'd be given kind of a small area, 1 meter by 2 meters, and they get put in a certain position, and they stay in that position, like on their knees, essentially, for 20 hours a day. I remember he said we were allowed to lie down for 4 hours a day. And they all said different things about food. I remember one said to me, we used to get one piece of cucumber, one piece of bread every day. Another said we would get it 3 times a day. I remember asking them about the toilet. They said, we were in like a, I don't know, I think there's a image from Amnesty International of what these kind of prisons look like, but they're not buildings with barbed wire going round. Maybe, I don't know, half the size of a football field. And there's like a tin roof, and they're all there just sitting there. There's one toilet between, I don't know, 100 of them or something. And they get, I said, how did you go to the toilet? They picked us up, took us to the toilet, and he goes, with our cuffs. And I remember him showing me, with the cuffs, we would pull down our pants, go to the toilet, and there was no kind of tissue, no water, nothing. And we had to put our pants back up ourselves and then go back and sit down. And he goes, unsurprisingly, infection was rife, skin infections, joint problems, joint infections. One of them said to me, I remember he said, one said to me, I never got to have a shower. One said, I remember we got to have a shower once a week, and it was always cold water. And he said, I'll never forget that, because he said, I remember one day a prisoner kind of cried out and said, why is it always cold? Why is it always cold water? And he said, and then we heard him scream because they'd thrown boiling water over him, and no one's checking, right? Who's going there to check what's going on in the Israeli prisons? I mean, the people don't even know if their loved ones are even in prison. That was one of the crazy things. I remember one of them said to me as I was leaving, he goes, it broke me, because there was a certain day that everybody knew that this was the day that people would leave the prison. And he said, people would start shouting out. They'd say, this is my wife's number, my father's number, my mother's number. Please call them. Please call them. And he goes, I remember, there was no way I was going to remember everyone's number. I just wasn't going to remember. But I would say to them all, yes, okay, I'll call them. And he goes, it would break me. And even now, there's not like a log or a list that they can go and approach the Israeli military or whoever and say, is my relative in prison or not? It's just, after going through the worst kind of trauma in your life, even as a doctor, I remember one doctor saying to me, I remember seeing 1,000 people die within a few days. Yeah. I can't imagine what effect that has on you. Right. And then to go from that to then kind of prison and the most awful torture, really, really horrific. Right. What does that do to a person? And it's just something I guess we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, and Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya is still in custody, I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, no, he's still kidnapped. He's still being tortured. We know that they've been targeting doctors. One of them, Adnan al-Bursh, was killed basically tortured to death, including sexually assaulted, sexually abused. So given what you knew going before you went there, Mohamed, and given what you learned once you were there, what made you want to go back? Like what kind of thinking did you have to go through to decide whether or not you were going to basically, risk your life by going back?
I think, you see what's happening there. And then, when you speak to people there, you kind of build this kind of connection. And I think a part of me just felt like I need to go now, because in 6 months, there might be nothing left to go to, and even now, I think sometimes, if I go, like now I was supposed to go for a couple of weeks, and I think, really what would I have done, in a couple of weeks? I mean, the guys there, they talk to me about, life-saving procedures that they're doing every day. But, it's probably just a drop in the water or the ocean, of the amount of work you have to do. But really it was for them. It was because, when you go there, I can't tell you how it uplifts them. Like they feel like, okay, yeah, we haven't been forgotten. It's just nice to see a familiar face for them, and they always say, please tell our story, tell everyone about what's happened here, please. You're our kind of mouthpiece, tell everybody. So yeah, that was my intention. We kind of, there's doctors who go kind of every few weeks from all the various charities, and the way it works is the Israelis get given the name in advance anyway, but there's a final list that comes out the day before the convoy goes into Gaza, and it can be as the convoy always leaves about 6 a.m. And you find out potentially up to kind of midnight the night before, so literally 6 hours before sometimes, whether you've been approved or not. You get this list, and the list, either your name comes back green, which means you're good to go, or it comes back kind of not highlighted, which means I think you're still being investigated or something, or it comes back red, which means you're not going to be allowed to go. And my name came back red. Literally, I just went a few days ago, and it came back red, having been green kind of in January. And there's no explanation. There's no kind of appeal process. There's nothing. It's just, you just get told your name's red. You need to go back home. That's it. There's no kind of questioning.
How many of you were turned away?
So there was 12 of us, and 4 got turned away.
What did you tell your loved ones before you left? But do you have to have a talk with people? Like, do you talk to them in case something happens?
Yeah. There's parents. I've got a really good kind of family support system around me, I guess. Parents. I've got 4 kids as well. The youngest is 2. But my wife's amazing. My wife's amazing, and she's. I think for us, we see it like a big, even kind of religiously, it's like a way for us to kind of give back to the people and make God happy. And for us, I think our thinking is, it doesn't matter how bad we might find it or how much we have to sacrifice. It'll never be as big as the sacrifice that the people there are making. It'll never compare.
Including if you yourself die.
Yeah, I mean, that's not something for us. We're really big believers in fate, and whatever destiny, whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and it's written. So all I can do is try my best, and whatever happens, happens.
Well, wow, that's for some reason I didn't expect you to have kids. Not that, I know people who have kids, but I was just like, you were talking about it with such fearlessness that I was like, oh, this guy is clearly single. I didn't want to pry, but I was like, okay, so what does he say with his parents or siblings or best friends or like partner maybe, but like, okay. So, but no, the whole thing. Okay. And Ahmed, what about you? You haven't gone to Gaza, but you did go to Iraq. It was during the ISIS, what would you say, crisis, rise, uptick? What made you want to go there and risk? And did you feel like you were risking your life when you went there?
Yeah, it does. If I'm honest with you, especially with everything we know about ISIS, brutal genocidal organization, whatever you want to call it, terrorist group. So that there is an element, and when you come face to face with them, it is a scary feeling. So you do feel at risk, when you're having to go in these convoys with the military and things. The difference is with myself and those who go to Gaza, for example, is that I was behind a government protection, whereas in Gaza, they are being attacked by basically a superpower backed by the US with the most sophisticated weaponry, whereas in Mosul we potentially had the protection of both the American military, the British military, and the Iraqi military. So kind of I can't even compare that situation with the other. Although of course there is always a risk whenever you go into a conflict zone. The difference is now, when they planned the Mosul offensive to liberate Mosul from ISIS, they did create humanitarian corridors, but they were protected. They were labeled by the Americans, the Brits, and the Iraqis. This is going to be a humanitarian corridor. Anyone who's not part of ISIS is free to leave. And they went into what were called internally displaced camps, so IDP camps, and they had access to healthcare, etc., until their papers had been cleared to prove that they weren't part of ISIS. Whereas the humanitarian corridors in Gaza were the ones that were attacked. Hospitals were protected in Gaza. The biggest hospital in Mosul, which catered for nearly 2 million people, and you can compare almost the population side of Mosul to Gaza, which is why it's such a comparison that you can make. But that hospital was again protected. Like ISIS did use part of it as their base, but the attacks that came from the Americans and the Iraqi military only was that part of the base. The rest of the hospital remained functional throughout the time. Whereas, like we've seen, 94% of all hospitals have been damaged. 1,400 healthcare workers have been killed, and that was as of May, according to Medical Aid Palestine. So when you ask me, did I feel scared? Yeah, but nothing in comparison to those that have had to go to Gaza, because you don't know who's going to be attacked. Like, there's videos of doctors walking to the hospital and the airstrike hits their head. And even now, like as Mohamed was saying about, all these life-saving procedures, but it's almost, you think about it, to what are they going to, these people who have just been saved from an airstrike, what are they going to come out into? A complete humanitarian crisis where OCHA, the UN humanitarian group, is saying that the starvation index is at the highest level it can be for 500,000 of the people that live in Gaza. So they're going to, they've had this life-saving operation, but they're going to die. And Dr. Abu Salmiya, who's the chief doctor at Al Shifa Hospital, he said that even the doctors now are too exhausted to look after their patients, because that's how much the level of starvation has reached. And just in one day, I think yesterday or the day before, 16 people died of starvation. And, for non-medics out there, you don't die of starvation after 1 or 2 days of starvation. To die of starvation, that's weeks of starvation. That's weeks of organized lack of access towards. And how many of these videos do we have to see of kids starving, and photos of bones, skin and bones, for us to be like, you know what, it's time to call it an end? And it really frustrates me and surprises me. Like, obviously, during the Vietnam War, it took one photo for the whole world to go against the US military action in Vietnam and stop the war. It was one photo of the napalm girl. We saw her, she's naked, she's skin and bones, and there's fire in the background. Just took one picture, and we have seen thousands of napalm girls in Gaza, yet Israel still gets back. Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel more congressional approval for more attacks. It was the only time I've heard Lindsey Graham say anything against the attacks by Israel is when a church was bombed by Israel. And that's the only time he's piped up. And then if you're going to sit there comparing ISIS to Hamas, ISIS was bombing churches. In Gaza, churches existed. So the real question is, who who is the closer to ISIS?
You mean Israel, the Israeli government, or Hamas?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, obviously it's the Israeli government. It's also based on such ignorance and like Islamophobia, that people they kind of depend on people not knowing anything about ISIS, not knowing anything about Hamas. So it's like, oh, Islam, they're the same, even though it's like comparing, I don't know, like AIPAC and Jewish Voice for Peace or
Yeah,
something.
of course. You can even say that it's the ignorance of what is a Palestinian, because a lot of them just assume, oh, Palestinian equals Muslim.
Right. That's
But actually, a lot of Palestinians are Christians, and so when Christian Zionists are funding an Israeli state, it's Christian Palestinians who are suffering.
But they don't care because they're not
But they
actually.
don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't. No. Yeah.
And it's just one thing, when you talk about, the war itself, but now this kind of stage of starvation, right? And baby feed, not able to get in. Imagine we're packing our bags, right, to go in today, that the guys who went in today, right? We have to make sure we don't take in too much baby feed, just in case when we cross the border, they take away our whole suitcase, or because you've taken too much. It's just bonkers, There's babies there who are going into hospital every day. They're getting like a cannula, a drip put into them. They're getting a bit of sugary water, and then they're said, okay, come back tomorrow now. That's all you can have today. It's just bonkers,
Are there any organizations that are able to get food in? People keep asking this question on a lot of WhatsApp groups I'm on, but anything?
Not on a large scale. I think it's all being controlled now by...
At the moment, no. I think I just read there's 900 trucks waiting to enter Gaza on the Israeli border. 900. And it's insane. And Mohamed will know better than me, like when it comes to like patients on intensive care, for example, all the guidelines in every hospital say early nutrition is better for outcomes. All the guidelines. So on day one of a patient entering intensive care, the idea is you start feeding them. And that's for, someone who's could be relatively fit and well beforehand. But these are people who have been through 2 years of a war and have no access to nutrition. They're at risk of infection, risk of, lack of malnutrition, risk of death, risk of liver disease.
Even just healing. Professor Nick Maynard, who's a surgeon who's there, who's just come back actually, he mentioned this, that, he's operating on all these people, and they haven't even got the right conditions for afterwards in intensive care. How do you expect their bodies to heal if they've got no nutrition going in?
Well, you guys have been so generous with your time. Any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
I mean, I think we should just call it what it is and just call it a genocide. It's not my words. Omer Bartov has called it a genocide, who is a professor of Holocaust and genocide studies at Brown University. And he was reluctant for the last 2 years to call it a genocide. And last week he's come out and said, you know what? It all points towards it being a genocide. And to be honest, it's not even my own words. Israeli ministers have been calling it a Holocaust for decades. They've been calling for a Holocaust in Gaza for decades. They've used the word Holocaust for decades. So I think we should just call it what it is. And this idea of creating this humanitarian city in Rafah is just a scary, scary documentation plan where, if it's not ethnic cleansing, I don't know what else you can call that kind of situation. And it's happened before. We've witnessed it in the past in the Namibian genocide in the early 20th century, where they shifted people into an area and it ended up committing genocide. It happened with the Armenian genocide. In fact, even happened during the Holocaust, where they put people into... The idea initially wasn't to kill everyone. It turned into that afterwards. And it's happening again now.
I just want to say on a kind of maybe a more micro level, right? I don't think it's okay for people not to talk about this. And when I say people, I mean the general Joe public, right? Like people who are going to work, watching Netflix, going out to theatre, whatever. I feel like in years to come, being silent on this issue is going to be something people will really, really regret. The fact that we should at least have spoken about this. We should be talking about it everywhere, at work, at schools, wherever, to say this is not acceptable. And so at the very least, we can all say, look, we spoke up against this. We did as much as we could do. for this issue, and we tried our best. And I think everybody should be able to say that.
Do you know what I think has happened though? Like, I think people have become numb because it's been 2 years, and I even remember it was kind of like, for me, especially at the start, you're flicking through all these like Instagram reels and TikToks or whatever, where you're seeing this destruction, and you're like, oh, this thing has broken my heart. Nothing can ever shatter my heart more. And then the next video is something that's even worse. Yeah. And it's been like that for now 2 years.
Yeah.
You can almost understand that people have become numb to it, because it's like we're witnessing a genocide, yet you expect me to be paying attention to the women's Euro football final or whatever.
Yeah.
Like it's a weird world dystopia that we live in.
Well, you are speaking out about it, so you guys are covered, and Mohamed, you're risking your life there. Not to make you feel bad, Ahmed, you're also very, very outspoken, and you do a lot of journalism on this, and you've been to Iraq, so you've risked your life way more than I have. But I just want to thank you guys so much for everything you do, and it's hard to keep hope or faith or optimism, but we have to do whatever we can. So, a lot of people are like, think about what people say, like, what would you have done during the Holocaust? So this is it.
Yeah.
For our time. Well, thank you both so much.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.